Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 8, Part 1. 17-year-old David Faraday eased his 1961 Rambler station wagon off the side of the road and put it in park. He then turned to Betty Lou Jensen in the passenger seat and smiled uneasily. Betty Lou was nervous too. It was her first date, and she had major butterflies. As David leaned in close to her, she couldn't help but let out an anxious giggle. The outburst was a relief to David, who was just as nervous. He snickered, and soon the two of them were laughing together. But the tension had hardly broken before a car sped by in the road beside them. Betty Lou took a breath and tried to relax. As it passed, David felt himself flush and was glad it was too dark to see. He did his best to act cool, slowly reaching his arm around her. Then, another car pulled up and parked right next to the couple. Frustrated, David prepared to yell the driver away. But when the stranger reached out of his window, David saw a gun in his hand, gleaming in the moonlight. The Zodiac's reign of terror began in the sleepy town of Venetia, a rural township of San Francisco Bay Area. Stella Madero, a local resident, will forever remember the night she came across the killer's first confirmed kill. On December 20th, around 11:10 p.m., Stella, her mother-in-law, and her daughter got in the car for a late-night trip. They drove down the dark, winding Lake Herman Road to pick up Stella's son from a show. Lake Herman Road was a small, quiet street that ran about 6 miles through the area. Stella drove carefully around the curves and didn't notice any other vehicles in her path that night. About 3 miles into the drive, Stella approached the entrance to a small pump station. The turn out near the station was a well-known lover's lane, where teenage couples went to enjoy some privacy. As she passed the spot, Stella noticed the Rambler station wagon parked on the side of the road. The driver's side door was open. She could see a teenage boy halfway hanging out of the car. The young girl was not far away, laying on the ground near the road, perfectly still. Stella hit the gas and sped away, now heading for the police station in Venetia. 10 minutes later, she came up behind a patrol car, flashed her lights, and honked at the policeman. Officers Daniel Pitta and William Warner listened to Stella's account and called in the report. They reached the area Stella described about 11:28 p.m. There they found a horrific scene. The girl, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, lay face down in the gravel by the road, almost 30 feet from the tan Rambler. A sickening pool of blood collected around her head. Officers searched in vain for a pulse, but she'd already lost too much blood. The autopsy later found that Betty Lou had been shot 5 times, the bullets penetrating her heart, liver, and right kidney. The boy, David Faraday, was not far away from Betty Lou. He lay face up near the car, his head also covered in blood. When the police arrived, David was still clinging to life. It was a cold night, only 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and they could still see his faint breath in the air. His fingers were locked around his class ring, adorned with a brilliant red stone. One of the officers said it looked like David was trying to protect it, as if someone had tried to take it from him before his death. An ambulance soon arrived for David. A bullet had gone through his left ear and into the back of his head, but he was still in better shape than Betty Lou. Some of the officers followed the ambulance to the hospital in hopes he'd recover and be able to give a statement. Others stayed behind to examine the scene more closely. Authorities found shells of several small caliber bullets on the ground and 2 bullet holes in the right side of the Rambler. Investigators stayed at the scene for several hours, completing their examination at about 4 in the morning. By that time, they'd received word that David had died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. All told, a fair amount of evidence was gathered, but none of it shed much light on what had happened. Venetia was a sleepy town, and there hadn't been a murder there in the past 5 or 6 years. Local officers weren't experienced in dealing with such violent crime, and the most important clue, the motive for the crime, couldn't be ascertained. It's undoubtedly more difficult to track down a killer with no apparent motive. With that said, studies have shown there are commonalities between senseless killers. These similarities can help police create a psychological profile to aid in their search. According to a 2006 paper published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, individuals who have committed impulsive, senseless murders demonstrate a severe weakness of impulse control, blurring of the boundaries between fantasy and reality, blunted and shallow emotional reactions, and a violent and primitive fantasy life. This could provide some insight into Zodiac's early motivations. A preoccupation with some kind of alternate reality may have driven him to enact his violent fantasies in the world, and because of his delusion, it's possible he did have a motive. It just might not make sense to outside observers. His victims may have been central to his fantasies without ever suspecting it. Regardless of the killer's true motivations, authorities at the time were stumped. The morning after the murder, officers interviewed David and Betty Lou's families in search of a suspect. Betty Lou's friend Sharon told detectives she'd seen Betty Lou with David the previous evening, but she had no idea where they went after 9 p.m. Betty Lou's sister suspected her jealous ex-boyfriend Ricky. Police investigated thoroughly, but found ultimately that he was with family and friends at the time of the killings. He had an airtight alibi. Another lead was provided by James A. Owen, a local man who drove past the pump station the previous night, around 11:15. He said he saw the station wagon parked at the turnout and that he noticed another vehicle beside it. Unfortunately, he could only remember that it was a mid-size, dark-colored car. He didn't see anybody outside of the car or nearby. This meant that the shooting must have occurred sometime between 11:15, when Owen drove past, and 11:20, the time Stella came by. It was an extremely small window for two murders to have occurred, and as the months passed and the investigation stalled, it looked more and more like the killer had committed a senseless act of violence and then disappeared. Though the prospect baffled the authorities at the time, it was the only thing that made sense. After all, even if someone had been specifically looking for David and Betty Lou, they couldn't have known beforehand that the two of them would be parked at the Lover's Lane. Neither one had told any of their friends where they'd be, and a reliable stream of witnesses had accounted for the cars in the area, so it was unlikely the couple was followed all the way to Lake Herman Road. The only dark color car seen by James Owen remained a loose thread, but as the months passed, police were unable to track it down, and it seemed like the trail had gone cold until the killer came back. 6 months after the Lake Herman Road murders, there was another murder just 4 miles away in the town of Vallejo. On July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron drove 19-year-old Michael Mago to a secluded lot near the entrance of the Blue Rock Springs Park. As she stopped the car, 22-year-old Darlene Farron turned down the radio. She looked at her date. Like the Lake Herman turnaround, the Blue Rock Springs lot was a well-known lover's lane. Darlene and Michael chatted for a while. Darlene joked with her date for wearing so many layers of clothes on such a warm day. He was wearing a coat, multiple shirts, and even a couple of pair of pants. Since he was thin, Michael was self-conscious about how lanky he looked, and had tried to look more muscular. As the couple laughed, they noticed another vehicle pull up behind them, its headlights shining in the rearview mirror. Michael and Darlene assumed it was a police officer and reached for their IDs. The man got out of the car, carrying a large flashlight. He approached the passenger side door where Michael was sitting. Michael rolled down his window, blinking at the bright light, but before he had a chance to say anything, the stranger emptied a 9mm Luger pistol into the vehicle. With no warning, Michael and Darlene were both hit and began gushing blood. Without a word, the shooter turned around and walked back to his car. He was almost there when Michael let out a scream, the pain unbearable. At the sound, the killer stopped and crept back to the passenger side window. Seeing that Michael was still alive, the killer fired again, hitting both Darlene and Michael 2 more times. Then, for the second time, the shooter nonchalantly returned to his car. Michael heard the vehicle slowly back out and turned down the road. As he gasped and bled all over the seat, Michael tried his best to hold on to a single memory. Despite the killer's best efforts, he was still alive, and through the glare of the flashlight, he'd seen the killer's face. Though it was late, there were several people nearby who heard the gunfire. One, a young woman in her late teens, called the police to report the shooting. At 12:10, the call was put out to the officers in the area, and 2 cars responded. The first, occupied by officers Lindemann and Meering, intercepted a Cadillac which appeared to be fleeing the scene. The officers pulled the Cadillac over. 2 19-year-olds, Andy and Betty, were in the car. Andy immediately asked if the stop was about, quote, the guy laying down back there, end quote. Apparently, he'd seen Michael McGuire writhing in pain on the ground of the parking lot, but hadn't stopped to help. Betty and Andy were detained on suspicion of being involved in the shooting, while the second patrol car continued on. Officer Richard Huffman arrived at the lot to find Darlene's brown Chevrolet Corvette parked near the top of the road. The headlights were still on, and a steady click of the turn signal mingled with the sound of the radio. The eerie scene turned heart-wrenching as Hoffman saw Michael McGough laying on his back outside the passenger door. He feebly gestured to the officer for help, coughing, bleeding on the pavement. Hoffman could tell Michael had been shot in the chest, the neck, and his left leg. Hoffman then looked in the driver's seat and saw Darlene Ferrin collapsed against the door. She'd been shot twice in the arm and once in her side. She was breathing, but just barely. Hoffman rushed to call an ambulance as another officer, Sergeant Conway, arrived. Conway tried to question Michael, gritting his teeth through the pain. Michael could only say a white male in a brown car was responsible. When the ambulance arrived, Hoffman rode along in case either of the victims spoke during the drive, but neither did. Darlene was declared dead by the time the ambulance reached the hospital. Michael was rushed into surgery. Meanwhile, authorities continued to comb the scene at the park. They dusted the car for fingerprints and interviewed people who had actually called the police, but they had little luck on getting specifics of the killer. At first, no one connected the attack on the Lake Herman Road murders, but the killer was determined to take credit for every bit of horror he'd wrought. At 12:40 a.m., 40 minutes after the attack, a call came into the Viejo police station. When the operator answered, a male voice told her he'd like to report a double murder, one that he'd committed. In addition to confessing to the attack on Darlene and Michael, the caller said he was responsible for the murders of those kids the previous December. His voice was steady and dispassionate, so much it gave the operator, Nancy Sloffer, the chills. At the end of what sounded like a rehearsed confession, the caller ended with an ominous, mocking goodbye. The haunting farewell stuck with Sloffer for the rest of her life. By taunting the police like this, the Zodiac knew he was putting himself at risk for getting caught. He'd revealed his voice and possibly the location he was calling from. At first, it seems like he had nothing to gain by jeering at the authorities, but criminology professor Scott Bond says that this kind of taunting was what exhilarated the Zodiac. Bond classifies the Zodiac as a thrill killer. The primary motive for thrill killers is to induce pain and terror in their victims prior to killing them. It provides stimulation and excitement. It soon became clear that the Zodiac planned on claiming many more lives, but the actual act of killing was almost an afterthought. What he really sought was to terrify the public, the authorities, and potential targets. The unsettling call to the police definitely did the trick. After the killer hung up, there was a frenzy of activity and confusion in the station. Police traced the call to a nearby gas station. The officers raced to the secluded phone booth, but found it empty. The gas station had closed 4 hours earlier, and no one was around the area when the call was made. The near miss shook many of the department who were unsure what to make of the call. At the time, there was little precedent for the Zodiac's crimes. Many of the serial killers that would later become infamous hadn't emerged yet. It was just over a month before the grisly Manson murders would rock the country. Police could only hope that they had a good lead on a suspect soon. Otherwise, it seemed certain the killer would strike again. Michael seemed their best shot at getting ahead of the killer. Remarkably, he survived several operations and stabilized over the next couple of days. When he recovered, he was able to give officers a full account of what had happened. According to Michael, Darlene had picked him up at his home around 11:30 that night. They had to be discreet, as Darlene was already married. The two of them were initially headed for a dinner to eat, but Darlene pulled a U-turn. As they approached the restaurant, Michael said that Darlene wanted to talk to him about something, but she never told him what. Instead, she pulled into the Blue Rock Springs lot. According to Michael, there were 3 other cars parked nearby. Soon the other cars took off, leaving him and Darlene alone in the dark. But only minutes later, another car pulled in behind them. The car stayed where it was for about a minute, then sped off. Michael didn't get a good look at the vehicle or its driver. 5 minutes later, another car pulled into the lot. Michael thought it was the same car that had just sped off, but couldn't be for sure. This time, the vehicle pulled up until it was only inches behind Darlene's car. The driver got out and approached the passenger side door. He held a bright flashlight in Michael's face. Michael could tell it was a young white male. He said he might be in his late 20s. He told authorities he thought the assailant was around 5'8", about 200 pounds, and had curly light brown hair. Michael seemed confident about the killer's appearance, but couldn't be positive about all the details. The painkillers he was on after surgery, as well as his lengthy recovery period, may have dulled his memory. Though he'd survived Zodiac's vicious attack, he hadn't fully escaped its consequences. He suffered from disabilities and the effects of the shooting for the rest of his life. In later years, it affected his ability to speak and work. But, thanks to Michael's resilience, police had the subject's description. However, they needed more, and they were willing to go to unusual lengths to gather new clues. For example, Darlene's babysitter, a woman named Karen, piqued their interest with some enticing testimony. She claimed she spotted a mysterious man stalking Darlene's house not long before the attack. According to her, a white man in a sedan had parked outside Darlene's house for several hours while Karen was babysitting one night. Karen relayed the incident to Darlene, who told Karen the man must have been checking up on her. Darlene explained that she witnessed the mystery man committing a murder, and he'd been watching her ever since. Karen claimed Darlene told her the man's name, but she couldn't recall it. Nevertheless, her statement encouraged authorities. They set Karen up with the hypnotist, hoping he could help her recall additional details. The session yielded a more in-depth description of the stalker, one that matched closely with Michael's description of the shooter. Despite the hypnotist's best effort, Karen still couldn't remember the man's name. Undeterred, police interviewed a multitude of Michael and Darlene's friends and family over the following days. Once again, there was no apparent motive, and thus, few solid leads. They were still perplexed by the taunting phone call. They were mystified further on July 7, when the parents of Darlene's husband reported they'd also gotten a suspicious call the night of the attack. According to them, the call came in around 1:30 a.m. They heard heavy breathing for a moment on the phone, then the caller hung up. Author's note: this is where the idea of heavy breathing originated. It's now found in pop culture and horror movies. There wasn't much to go on, but it did deepen the detective's suspicions that the killer was intent on mocking his victims. His mockery would only grow more extreme, and his scare tactics were more terrifying. By July of 1969, the Zodiac killer had attacked 4 known victims, but his true notoriety would arise when he began taunting the public and the police with menacing phone calls. Police suspected that the killer wanted to terrorize people and mock his victims. Their suspicions were confirmed on July 30th, 1969, when the killer emerged once again. He clearly wanted attention. That day, 3 major newspapers all received mysterious, almost identical letters. They were the first of many communications from the Zodiac. He claimed responsibility for the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs murders. To prove it, he gave a short list of facts about each crime that only the police or the murderer could know. None of the information had been released to the press. Author's note: as a detective, these details are intentionally kept secret. It helps when you're interrogating a suspect, but also just as important, on a high-profile case. It can help you identify people that would admit to the crime, like criminals that are imprisoned and just want the notoriety, if they're already serving a life sentence. Zodiac gave the brand of ammunition used in both crimes. He also gave some specifics about his victims and the number of shots fired. Author's note: in police self-defense shootings, it's common the officer has no idea how many shots they fired. It's because of adrenaline and that they're in flight or fight. That Zodiac knew how many shots he had fired speaks to his level of calm. After supplying his proof, the Zodiac ended with a demand. Along with each letter he'd sent to the newspapers, he'd included a separate page written in code. Each paper got 1/3 of the code, and the Zodiac commanded that they had to print the ciphers on the front pages of their paper. According to him, cracking the ciphers would reveal his identity. In each letter, he ended it with a warning, quote, "If you do not print this cipher by the afternoon of Fry, 1st of Aug, 69, I will go on a killing rampage. Friday night, I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend." End quote. Following the threat, the letters were signed with a symbol resembling the crosshairs of a gun sight. The same symbol was found in the cipher, which also included English letters, mirrored letters, U.S. naval flags, and mathematical symbols. The letters were turned over to the police departments. They were then sent to a naval radio station to see if the cryptologists there could break the code. In the meantime, the papers faced a predicament. They weren't sure which action carried a greater risk, publishing the letters and inciting panic, or hold them back and defy the murderer. If they choose not to circulate the letters, then a dozen people were killed. Some might blame the publishers for refusing to follow the killer's instructions, And, as offensive as the situation was, publishing the letters was undeniably mutually beneficial from a business standpoint. The papers wanted to sell more copies, and the killer wanted more publicity. All three papers consulted each other and eventually published the letters, although not exactly to the killer's specifications. The Vallejo Times-Herald published the cipher on its front page. By the August 1 deadline, the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner published it on page 4 of its August 2 joint newspaper. As expected, the story received nationwide attention. People all over the country tried to crack the Zodiac code. The killer was getting exactly what he wanted: infamy. Law enforcement could only hope the cipher eventually revealed his identity, and the murderer's need for fame would be his downfall. The chief of the police department publicly challenged the Zodiac to send even more proof that he was truly the killer. In actuality, the police were firmly convinced the author of the letters was the perpetrator of the murders. He had provided more than enough proof in his letters. The challenge was meant to bait the killer. It was years before the term serial killer gained any popularity, or the FBI began developing criminal profiles. But the police astutely recognized that a fame-obsessed criminal like the Zodiac could be tempted into a trap. On August 7th, the killer responded to the chief's request. Another letter to the Examiner. It began with the now famous line, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." In the following 3 pages, the Zodiac provided more details on how he committed the first murders. The information confirmed the Zodiac was no imposter, but more importantly, it gave the police some insight on how the killer operated. For example, the killer gave a patient and detailed description of the way he attached a flashlight to his gun barrel before the Blue Rock Spring murder. It revealed his careful and exacting planning. His eccentric spelling mistakes throughout the entire letter also led detectives to believe he was purposefully disguising his speech, possibly to hide his true intelligence or level of education. Even so, there wasn't much to go off of. The most significant impact of the letter was it gave the killer a name, one which ended up sticking: the Zodiac. With his blackmail of the press and his spooky name, it was clear the Zodiac was deliberately crafting a public persona for himself. By hiding behind spelling mistakes and misleading detectives about his motivations, the real killer wasn't making himself famous. Instead, he was elevating the character he'd created, the Zodiac. It may be that creating the Zodiac identity, the killer was seeking to disassociate himself from his own crimes. Author Soren Kosgaard writes, "The Zodiac's actions are consistent with the psychological concept of de-individualization." It states that people can lose their own sense of self, especially in a violent group or setting. The usage of the name Zodiac could have been a component to that process, as it would have allowed him to focus and identify with the skills, capabilities, and temperaments of his imagined character, Zodiac. The loss of self-identity may have also been the ability to block out feelings of guilt. The Zodiac name, then, might not have been chosen to simply terrify the public. It could also have served to give the killer a buffer between his actions and reality. If he was prone to violent fantasies already, it may have been easy for the Zodiac to let go of his real identity and his final connection with reality. The police felt like they were already chasing a ghost, and the name of the killer remained a mystery. All the authorities had were a couple of unsettling letters and possibly meaningless series of bizarre symbols. They had to hope they would catch a break soon. Luckily they did. The day after the Zodiac's second letter, a couple in Salinas, California, called the San Francisco Chronicle. They'd broken the encryption. Don and Betty Harden, 2 ordinary puzzle buffs. They'd spent the previous 2 days, around 29 hours in their estimation, solving the riddle. The key to their strategy was looking for the word kill and the phrase, "I like killing," which they thought might be hidden somewhere in the code. They guessed correctly. But even then, cracking the cipher wasn't easy. Zodiac had intentionally misspelled words, omitted at least one important word, and used multiple symbols to represent the same letters of the alphabet throughout. Unfortunately, the solved cipher failed to reveal the name of the Zodiac. He explained why at the end of the uncoded message, quote, "The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all that I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife," end quote. The police were left with only guesses about how to proceed next. The Zodiac was beating them, That much was made clear. And he was just getting started. This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 8, Part 1, Zodiac. Thank you for listening, and God bless.